When a simple day at the park turns into a nightmare, Ethan Green's life changes forever. His two young kids, Chloe and Noah, are unjustly stopped and searched by police officers, treated like suspects without reason. But Ethan won't stand by silently. As a diplomat and a father, he takes on a system that's long ignored its biases, pushing for real change in a town that's not ready to face its flaws. The encounter quickly goes viral, sparking protests, heated debates, and forcing the entire community to choose a side. Can one father's fight for justice lead to lasting change? Or will the forces against him prove too strong? Watch to see how a moment of injustice turns into a powerful movement. And if you're ready to be part of the change, like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that matter. Share your thoughts below. Can one voice really make a difference? The late summer sun hovered low over Riverton Park, casting long shadows across the playground and the winding paths that cut through the well-kept lawns. The air was warm, humming with the sounds of crickets and the occasional bark of a dog in the distance. Chloe Green, with her ponytail streaming behind her, darted ahead on her bike, weaving playfully around benches and flower beds. "Catch up, slowpoke," she called back to her younger brother Noah, who was pedaling furiously to close the gap. He grinned in determination, his curly hair bouncing with each push of his feet against the pedals. Chloe had always been the adventurous one, leading the way in their games and neighborhood explorations, while Noah followed, cautious but loyal. "I'll beat you this time," Noah shouted, puffing as he tried to gain speed. Chloe laughed, her voice ringing through the park. For a moment, they were just kids, carefree and lost in their own world. But as they rounded the curve near the old oak tree, Chloe caught sight of a police patrol car rolling slowly along the path. It was an unusual sight in Riverton, where the most excitement usually came from the occasional barbecue or community gathering in the park. She glanced over her shoulder at Noah, who had noticed the car too, but neither of them thought much of it. It was just a normal summer evening, like so many others they'd spent here. As Chloe slowed down, pulling her bike to a stop by a picnic table, the patrol car came to a halt nearby. The engine idled, a low growl against the quiet of the park. Two officers stepped out, one tall and broad-shouldered, with a square jaw and a stern expression, his badge reading Officer Dawson. The other officer, Reed, was shorter. Her face sat in a neutral mask as she scanned the park. "Hey, you two, stop right there!" Officer Dawson's voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. Chloe and Noah froze, exchanging a quick, uncertain look. Noah instinctively gripped the handlebars of his bike tighter, his knuckles turning white. "Is something wrong?" Chloe asked, trying to keep her voice steady as the officers approached. She glanced down at her sneakers, scuffing them nervously against the concrete path. She'd never been in trouble before, never even been scolded by a teacher, let alone confronted by the police. "What are you doing out here?" Dawson demanded, crossing his arms over his chest. His eyes flicked between the two children, then settled on Chloe's backpack, which she had slung over her shoulder. "Where do you live?" Chloe hesitated, taken aback by the officer's tone. "We live right over there," she said, gesturing vaguely in the direction of their house. "We're just riding our bikes. We've been here 100 times. "Show me what's in the bag," Dawson said abruptly, ignoring her explanation. He reached for Chloe's backpack before she could react, yanking it open. Chloe recoiled, her face flushing with a mixture of anger and confusion as he rummaged through her things. Just a worn-out library book, an apple, and a few stray crayons. Noah took a step forward, his small frame stiff with the instinct to protect his sister. "You can't do that," Chloe protested, her voice rising as she tried to pull the bag back. "We didn't do anything wrong." Her face burned with embarrassment, feeling exposed and small under the officer's scrutiny. Officer Reed remained silent, her arms folded, but there was a flicker of discomfort in her expression. She glanced sideways at Dawson, as if to suggest he should tone it down, but she didn't intervene. "Step back, both of you," Dawson ordered, his voice colder now, not bothering to explain his actions. "We got a call about suspicious activity, kids hanging around where they shouldn't be." "Suspicious?" Chloe echoed, her voice cracking. She looked to Noah, whose wide eyes mirrored her own fear. They had been coming to this park for years. It was part of their neighborhood, their routine, their home. How could they be suspicious here? Noah's voice wavered as he spoke up. Can we call our dad? He should know what's happening. Dawson shot him a look of irritation. Who are you calling? He barked, but Chloe had already caught her phone out of her pocket, shaking hands. We need to call him, Chloe whispered, more to herself than to the officers. She dialed quickly, her fingers fumbling over the screen as she pressed it into her ear. In his office at the State Department, Ethan Green's mind was focused on the nuances of a diplomatic report about an international trade negotiation. He leaned back in his chair, adjusting his reading glasses as he scanned the text on his laptop. A photograph of Chloe and Noah on his desk caught his eye. Last summer at the beach, all smiles and sandy faces. He felt a brief pang of longing to be with them instead of buried in paperwork. His phone rang, pulling him out of his thoughts. He answered with a warm smile in his voice. Hey, sweetheart, how's the bike ride? But what came through the speaker made his heart seize. Chloe's voice was small, barely controlled. Dad, the police stopped us. They're going through my bag. They said we're suspicious. Ethan straightened abruptly, his mind racing to catch up with what he was hearing. What? Where are you, Chloe? Are you okay? We're at the park, Chloe said, her voice trembling. Noah's scared, and the officer's being really mean. He took my bag and won't tell us why. Ethan's pulse hammered in his ears as he struggled to keep his voice calm. I'm on my way. Just stay there, Chloe. Don't say anything more to them until I get there. I'll be there in 10 minutes. He ended the call, his hands shaking as he slid the phone into his pocket. This wasn't the first time he had faced a situation tinged with prejudice, but never had it struck so close to home. Never had it involved his own children. He thought of Chloe's voice, how small and uncertain it had sounded, and anger flared hot in his chest, mingling with a deep sense of urgency. Ethan grabbed his jacket, striding through the marble halls of the State Department, his mind already racing through the possible scenarios. He fired off a quick message to his assistant, canceling his remaining appointments for the day, then headed for the parking garage, his footsteps echoing in the corridor. As he sped down the highway toward Riverton Park, the city's familiar skyline blurring past, Ethan's mind shifted between memories of teaching Chloe and Noah about fairness, kindness, and the value of standing up for what was right, and the harsh reality of their current situation. He had always tried to prepare them for the complexities of the world, but this was something he had never wanted them to experience. When he finally pulled into the park's lot, he spotted Chloe and Noah standing near the patrol car, looking small and pale against the shadow of the officers. The sight nearly stopped him in his tracks. His heart twisted painfully at their frightened faces. But he steeled himself, pulling on the mask of calm he had worn in tense negotiations around the world, and approached with measured steps. The officers turned as he neared, their expressions wary, but Ethan didn't give them time to speak. What exactly is going on here? His voice was cold, carrying the edge of a man accustomed to demanding answers. Dawson shifted, his initial bravado giving way to uncertainty. You're the father? These kids were acting suspicious, hanging around where they shouldn't be. We had to check them out. Ethan glanced at Chloe, her cheeks stained with tears she was trying to blink away, and felt a renewed surge of anger. He turned back to Dawson, his jaw tight. They are children, playing in a public park. Your behavior is completely out of line. Sergeant Mitchell emerged from the police car at that moment, a middle-aged officer with a gruff demeanor, and approached the scene. Let's keep it civil here, he said, his tone placating. But Ethan wasn't interested in civility. You've humiliated my children without cause, and you expect civility? Ethan's voice dropped lower, almost dangerous in its quietness. I demand an explanation, or we'll be taking this matter much further than a conversation in a park. Mitchell's eyes flicked to Dawson, who had paled slightly, then back to Ethan. Let's discuss this down at the station, he suggested, trying to diffuse the tension. We can sort it all out there. Ethan nodded, but his expression remained hard. Fine, but understand this. You will not treat my children like this ever again, and you will explain yourselves, fully. Chloe and Noah huddled closer to their father as they made their way to the car, feeling a small measure of relief in his presence. but the uncertainty of what lay ahead weighed heavily on them all. Ethan's car sped through the quiet streets of Riverton, each traffic light feeling like an eternity. As he approached the police station, his knuckles whitened on the steering wheel, and the memory of Chloe's tearful voice over the phone echoed in his mind. His thoughts shifted from diplomatic meetings to a clear, singular focus. He needed answers, and he would not let his children be treated unjustly. He parked in front of the nondescript building of the Riverton police station, its brick walls reflecting the fading light of the evening. The once familiar streets of his hometown now felt foreign, charged with an intensity he hadn't felt in years. Ethan glanced back at Chloe and Noah, who huddled together in the back seat, their faces pale with anxiety. "Stay close to me, okay?" he said gently, offering them a tight smile that he hoped would reassure them. Chloe nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line as she clutched Noah's hand. She was trying to be brave, but Ethan could see the tremor in her shoulders. Inside the station, the air was cooler but tense, the fluorescent lights casting a sterile glow over the worn linoleum floors. The front desk officer looked up, his indifferent expression shifting slightly as he recognized Ethan's face. Ethan strode to the counter, his children at his side, and addressed the officer directly. "I'm here to speak with Sergeant Mitchell about the incident involving my children." "Now," Ethan demanded, his voice carrying a tone that brooked no argument. He could feel Chloe's small hand tighten around his, a reminder of why he was here and what was at stake. The officer at the desk stammered slightly, glancing nervously at Chloe and Noah before nodding. "I'll let him know you're here, Mr. Green." He picked up the phone, speaking in hushed tones. Ethan kept his expression neutral, but inside a storm raged. He knew that his status as a diplomat might get him in the door, but he also knew it shouldn't take that to ensure fair treatment for his children. A few minutes later, Sergeant Mitchell appeared, his expression tight as he led them into a small, windowless room off the main hallway. The door clicked shut behind them, and Ethan noted the harsh, buzzing hum of the overhead lights. Chloe and Noah sat close to him on the small couch, their eyes fixed on the floor. Mitchell gestured to a metal chair. "Mr. Green, why don't you take a seat and we can discuss this calmly?" Ethan remained standing, his arms crossed over his chest. "There's nothing calm about what happened tonight. My children were humiliated and frightened in a place that should be safe for them. I want to know why." Mitchell sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly as he took a seat behind a cluttered desk. He leafed through some papers, as if the motions could delay the inevitable confrontation. "Look, this was just a misunderstanding. Our officers received a call about suspicious individuals in the park. 2 kids fitting their description. They were just doing their jobs." "Suspicious?" Ethan's voice hardened, his hands balling into fists at his sides. He struggled to keep his anger from spilling over. "My children were playing in the same park they visited 100 times. What exactly made them suspicious? Was it the color of their skin?" Mitchell shifted uncomfortably, but his face remained impassive. "It's standard procedure to investigate all reports, Mr. Green. If they felt threatened, my children are 12 and 10. Ethan interrupted, his tone growing colder. "They posed no threat, and you know it. This was not about a report, it was about prejudice, and I will not let it go unchallenged." The air between them crackled with tension, each word carrying the weight of a confrontation neither had expected but now couldn't avoid. Chloe glanced up at her father, her wide eyes filled with uncertainty. Ethan softened for a moment, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "Mr. Green, let's not escalate this further," Mitchell said, his voice adopting a tone of strained patience. "We can handle this internally. We'll issue a formal apology to your children and ensure the officers understand the mistake." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to take a deep breath. "An apology is not enough. This isn't just about my kids. It's about how your department treats people like them, and the fear it creates. If you think a few words will make this go away, you're mistaken." Mitchell frowned, realizing that Ethan wasn't going to back down. He cast a glance at Chloe and Noah, who clung to their father's side and sighed heavily. "All right, let me speak with the officers involved, and we'll go from there." But Ethan's gaze never wavered. "I'll wait," he said firmly. And so they did, waiting as the minutes stretched, the atmosphere in the small room thick with unspoken words and questions that hung in the air. As Ethan and his children sat in that room, the outside world was already beginning to learn of the incident that had shaken their family. A passerby who had witnessed the encounter in the park had recorded a brief video of Officer Dawson searching Chloe's bag. Her face streaked with tears as she tried to hold herself together. The video, shaky but unmistakably clear, captured the moment when Dawson raised his voice at Chloe, and when Noah stepped forward, looking desperate and scared. The video was posted to social media that evening, with a caption that read, "Two kids just trying to play in the park. This is how they get treated. Joshua justice for Chloe and Noah." Within hours, it had been shared thousands of times, accompanied by angry comments demanding accountability from the Riverton Police Department. The reactions came swiftly. Local news stations picked up the story, reaching out to community leaders and advocates. Maria Harper, a local activist who had spent years pushing for police reform, was one of the first to speak out. She appeared on a late-night segment, her voice filled with restrained outrage as she discussed the incident. "This isn't just about a mistake," Maria said, her eyes burning with conviction. "This is about a pattern that says children like Chloe and Noah are treated with suspicion simply because of the way they look. We need to ask ourselves why that is, and what we're going to do to change it." Ethan's phone buzzed with notifications as he sat in the dimly lit room, waiting for Mitchell's return. He glanced at the screen, seeing messages from colleagues, friends, and even strangers expressing their support. His inbox filled with requests from reporters wanting his side of the story. Noah peeked up at his father, his voice small. "Dad, what's going to happen to us?" Ethan put an arm around his son's shoulders, pulling him close. "Nothing's going to happen to you," he said firmly, though the uncertainty gnawed at him. "I won't let them hurt you again." Chloe leaned into him, her expression still troubled. "Why did they think we were bad, Dad?" she asked softly, her words tugging at Ethan's heart. "Why us?" Ethan's throat tightened, and he struggled for the right words. How could he explain to his daughter that this was something he had spent his life fighting against, but that it had come to find them regardless? He smoothed a hand over Chloe's hair, feeling the weight of the moment settling into his bones. "It's not about you, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice rough. "It's about how some people see others, people who look different from them. But we're going to change that. We're going to make sure that what happened today never happens again." When Sergeant Mitchell finally returned, he wasn't alone. Officer Dawson trailed behind him, looking far less confident than he had in the park. His expression was tense, eyes darting between Ethan and the children. "We're prepared to apologize for the distress caused to your children," Mitchell began, his tone formal and rehearsed, "and we'll be conducting an internal review of the officer's actions to ensure that our procedures are followed correctly in the future." Ethan stood, his back straight, and took a step toward Dawson, who visibly flinched. "This apology means nothing if it doesn't come with real change," Ethan said, his voice cutting through the sterile air of the station. "I expect this to be more than just a gesture. We need a real investigation into why my children were treated this way, and I want to see transparency in every step of that process." Dawson opened his mouth as if to protest, but Mitchell cut him off with a raised hand. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Green," he said tersely. "For now, I suggest you take your kids home." But as Ethan turned to leave, his mind was already working through the next steps. He knew this battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. The events of that night at Riverton Park, in the subsequent police station encounter, rippled through the town like a stone dropped into a pond. The next morning, Ethan awoke to a flood of messages on his phone. Missed calls from reporters, texts from friends offering support, and emails from community leaders who had seen the video. He rubbed a hand over his face, exhaustion weighing down his every movement, but there was no time for rest. Today would set the tone for everything that came next. Downstairs, Chloe and Noah sat quietly at the kitchen table, picking at their breakfast. Their usual chatter was replaced by a thick silence, the kind that hung heavy in the air and made every sound feel too loud. Ethan poured himself a cup of coffee, trying to think of the right words to reassure them, but the conversation with Sergeant Mitchell replayed in his mind, drowning out everything else. He sat down across from them, studying their tired faces, the way Noah's shoulders sagged as if he were trying to disappear into his seat. Chloe was staring into her cereal bowl, her brow furrowed. How are you both holding up? Ethan asked softly, his voice rough with concern. Noah shrugged, not meeting his father's eyes. Okay, I guess, he mumbled. Are we in trouble, Dad? Ethan's chest tightened. He reached out, gently squeezing Noah's hand. No, buddy. You did nothing wrong. What happened yesterday? It wasn't your fault. It's the adults who messed up, not you. Chloe looked up then, her eyes filled with a quiet, desperate confusion. But why did they think we were dangerous? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why were they so mean? Ethan swallowed hard, struggling against the urge to let his anger show. He didn't want his children to see him like this. Full of a fury he usually kept hidden behind a diplomat's mask. But he couldn't lie to them either. Not about this. Some people have wrong ideas about others, Chloe, he said carefully. They see what they expect to see, instead of what's really there. And that's not fair. But we're going to show them they're wrong. We're going to make sure they see the truth. That afternoon, Ethan received a call from Reverend Samuel Parker, the pastor of Riverton Community Church. He was a tall, imposing man with a booming voice that could fill the church hall without a microphone. But he had a gentleness about him that made him a natural leader among Riverton's residents. Ethan, I saw the video, Reverend Parker said, his voice grave. I can't tell you how sorry I am that Chloe and Noah had to go through that. We're holding a meeting tonight at the church. Folks are already talking about coming together. I think you should be there. Ethan hesitated, glancing at the television in the living room, which was playing clips of local news segments discussing the incident. He felt the weight of the media's focus pressing down on him, and he knew that speaking out would only put more eyes on his family. But as he looked back at Chloe and Noah, who were huddled together on the couch, he made up his mind. I'll be there, Reverend, he said firmly, and I'll speak. The church was packed that evening, the pews filled with faces Ethan had known for years. Neighbors, parents from the local schools, and small business owners who had watched Chloe and Noah grow up. But now they all seemed different, united by a common sense of outrage and determination. Ethan could feel the tension buzzing in the air as he took his seat near the front, flanked by Maria Harper and other community activists. Reverend Parker stood at the pulpit, raising his hands to quiet the crowd. Thank you all for coming on such short notice, he began, his deep voice echoing off the stained glass windows. We're here because something happened that shouldn't have, and we're here to make sure it never happens again. Ethan's heart pounded as Parker gestured for him to come forward. He hadn't prepared a speech. He didn't need one. The words burned inside him, ready to spill out. He stood behind the pulpit, looking out at the faces that had once been a comforting backdrop to his life in Riverton, and took a deep breath. Yesterday, my children faced something no child should ever have to face, he began, his voice steady but thick with emotion. They were treated like criminals in a place that has always been their home, and it wasn't because of anything they did. It was because of what they looked like. A murmur ran through the crowd, and Ethan saw people nodding, their faces grim with understanding. He pressed on, feeling his own emotions rising with each word. I've spent my life working as a diplomat, trying to build bridges between different countries, different cultures. But it's hard to build those bridges when the place you call home still has walls built on fear and prejudice. Yesterday, those walls came crashing down on my family. He paused, letting the silence settle, then spoke again, this time addressing the entire room. I won't let this go. I won't let Riverton go back to being a place where my children and others like them have to be afraid. But I can't do it alone. I need all of you with me. The crowd erupted into applause, and Maria stepped forward, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. We've got your back, Ethan, she said, her voice firm, and we're not going to let this rest. The days that followed saw Riverton transformed into a place of vibrant protest and unity, but also of growing tension. Signs sprang up on lawns and windows, reading Justice for Chloe and Noah, and No More Fear. Every day, people gathered outside the Riverton police station, holding candles and chanting for change. Chloe and Noah watched from their living room window as crowds swelled on the streets, their small faces pressed against the glass. Ethan tried to shield them from the worst of it, but he knew he couldn't keep them hidden away. One morning, as he readied himself for another meeting with community leaders, Chloe approached him in the hallway, her face set with determination that reminded him so much of his own. "Dad, can we go to one of the protests with you?" she asked. "I want to see it for myself." Ethan hesitated. "It might be a lot for you to handle, Chloe. There are going to be a lot of people, and not everyone agrees with what we're doing." But Chloe's eyes were resolute. "I'm not scared anymore," she said quietly. "I want to see the people who are helping us, and the people who aren't." In the end, he couldn't deny her. That evening, they stood together outside the police station, holding candles with the other protesters. Noah clung to his sister's side, watching the faces in the crowd. Some were familiar, neighbors who had lived down the street from them for years. Others were strangers, drawn by the video that had turned their family's story into a rallying cry. Ethan's heart swelled as he watched his children stand side by side with people who believed in their fight. He took the microphone when the crowd quieted, feeling the weight of their hope pressing down on him, mingling with his own uncertainty. "We are here because we believe in a better future," he said, his voice carrying over the hushed crowd. "A future where kids like Chloe and Noah don't have to be afraid of those who are supposed to protect them. But that future won't happen unless we keep pushing, unless we demand accountability. Not just tonight, but every day." The crowd cheered, and as the sound rolled over them, Ethan looked down at Chloe, who was staring up at him with something like pride in her eyes. He knew then that whatever came next, he had already won a small victory, showing his children that they could stand up even when it was hard. As the protests continued to grow, so did the resistance from those in Riverton who viewed the Green family's fight for justice as an attack on their way of life. Signs began to appear in a different part of town: "Support our police," and "No more disrespect." Local radio shows hosted debates where callers argued that the officers were only doing their jobs and that Ethan was overreacting. The tension in Riverton thickened, dividing the town along lines of support and resentment. Ethan's phone buzzed constantly, messages of support from allies mixed with threats and accusations from anonymous numbers. It was a new kind of pressure, one that pressed down on him even in the quiet of his home. He tried to keep a brave face for Chloe and Noah, but he couldn't hide his weariness from them entirely. One afternoon, as he prepared to head out to another meeting with community leaders, Chloe found him sitting on the edge of his bed, his shoulders slumped and his head in his hands. She hesitated in the doorway, then came over to sit beside him. "Dad?" she asked softly. "Are you okay?" Ethan looked up, offering a small, tired smile. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "I'm okay, sweetie. Just a little tired, but we're making progress." Chloe leaned into him, silent for a moment. "It's hard, isn't it?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "All these people who don't want to listen." Ethan nodded, his throat tight. "It is. But sometimes the right thing is the hardest thing, and we can't give up even when it feels like no one's listening. That's how we make a difference." She seemed to think about that, her brow furrowed in concentration. Then she straightened, giving him a determined look. "I won't give up either." Ethan hugged her tightly, feeling a rush of pride mingled with the bittersweet realization that his children had been forced to grow up too quickly. As he left for the meeting, he promised himself that he would keep fighting not just for Chloe and Noah, but for every child who deserved to grow up without fear. The turning point came when Councilman Robert Baker, a prominent supporter of Riverton's police force, invited Ethan to participate in a live televised debate on the local news channel. Baker had built a reputation as a staunch defender of law and order, often positioning himself as the voice of Riverton's more conservative residents. He saw the protests as a threat to the town's stability and was eager to challenge Ethan directly. Ethan hesitated before accepting. He knew that Baker would try to paint him as a radical, someone stirring up trouble for his own gain. But he also knew that this was his chance to speak directly to those who still doubted the need for change. And if he could reach even a few of them, it would be worth it. The studio lights were harsh as Ethan took his seat across from Baker, the set framed by images of our Riverton's Main Street and the town's crest. The moderator, Jennifer Lewis, introduced the segment with a grave expression. "Tonight we have two voices representing different sides of the recent unrest in Riverton. Ethan Green, whose children were involved in the incident that sparked protests, and Councilman Robert Baker, a supporter of Riverton's police department. Thank you both for being here. Ethan nodded, folding his hands in his lap to keep them from shaking. He could feel the weight of Chloe's and Noah's trust pressing on him, alongside the hope of all those who had joined their cause. Baker leaned forward, his expression a mix of confidence and disdain. Thank you, Jennifer, Baker began, his tone firm and authoritative. Let's be clear about what we're dealing with. This town has always respected its police force. They've kept us safe for generations. But now, thanks to Mr. Green's decision to turn a minor incident into a public spectacle, our officers are under attack. And the result? Chaos in our streets. Ethan felt a flare of anger, but forced himself to remain composed. He waited for Baker to finish before leaning slightly forward, his voice measured but intense. Councilman Baker, with all due respect, what happened to my children wasn't a minor incident. They were treated like criminals in a park they've played in their entire lives. They were scared, humiliated, and made to feel like they didn't belong in their own town. Baker scoffed, his smile thin and condescending. And your solution, Mr. Green, is to stir up protests and make our officers afraid to do their jobs? You're turning this town into a battleground for your own political agenda. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he refused to be baited. He thought of the crowd gathered outside the station, of Maria's determined speeches, and of Chloe's words that morning. This isn't about politics, he said firmly, his voice rising with conviction. This is about the right of every person, every child, to feel safe in their community, to be treated with respect, regardless of what they look like. And if we have to challenge the status quo to make that happen, then so be it, Jennifer cut in, sensing the tension escalating. Mr. Green, what would you say to those who feel that your actions are dividing the town? Ethan took a deep breath, letting the question hang in the air for a moment. Change always feels like division to those who benefit from things staying the same, he replied quietly. But I believe Riverton can be better than this. I believe we can face our flaws and build a community where everyone is treated fairly. That's not division, it's progress. Baker shook his head, but for the first time Ethan noticed uncertainty in his eyes. The debate ended with no clear winner, but as the cameras cut off and the studio lights dimmed, Ethan felt a flicker of hope. He had spoken his truth, and now the people of Riverton would have to decide what kind of town they wanted to be. A week after the debate, the results of the internal investigation were finally released, but the findings were a bitter disappointment. The report, issued by Sergeant Mitchell and signed off by Riverton's police chief, claimed that officers Dawson and Reed had acted within protocol and that no evidence of racial bias had been found. The report cited a vague complaint about suspicious activity and defended the officers' actions as standard procedure. The announcement came during a press conference at the police station, attended by reporters and community members, including Ethan and Maria Harper. Ethan felt his heart sink as he listened to the police chief's carefully worded statement, which managed to acknowledge the children's distress without admitting any wrongdoing. This investigation was thorough, and we are committed to improving communication with the community, the chief said, reading from a prepared script. We apologize for any misunderstanding that may have arisen from this incident, and we are dedicated to fostering a safe and inclusive environment for all of Riverton's residents. Ethan stood at the back of the crowd, clenching his fists as a murmur of frustration rippled through the gathered protesters. He caught Maria's eye, and she shook her head slightly, her expression hardening. This wasn't the outcome they had fought for. As the chief tried to wrap up the press conference, Ethan pushed forward through the crowd, his heart pounding in his chest. He stepped up to the line of microphones, cutting through the polite chaos of reporters scrambling for sound bites. I'm sorry, but that's not enough, Ethan's voice rang out, sharp and clear. The camera swung back to him, capturing the flash of determination in his eyes. You can't just say the words and expect everything to go back to the way it was. My children were targeted, not because of what they did, but because of who they are. And that's not something you can hide behind a report. The police chief's expression tightened as he turned to Ethan, irritation flashing in his eyes. Mr. Green, we've followed the appropriate procedures. Procedures that failed my children, Ethan interrupted, his voice rising with anger. Procedures that failed every person in this town who's ever felt like they were treated differently because of how they look. This isn't over. We demand an independent review, one that isn't conducted by the same people who are trying to protect themselves. The crowd erupted into a mix of cheers and shouts, and the press conference quickly devolved into chaos as reporters jostled for position, firing questions at the police chief and Ethan. Maria stepped forward, taking Ethan's hand and raising it above their heads, a defiant gesture that was caught by every camera in the crowd. Ethan's pulse thrummed in his ears as he met the police chief's glare with unflinching resolve. He knew that challenging the system like this would only make things harder, but he also knew he couldn't back down. Not now, not when they were so close to the truth. The demand for an independent review quickly gained momentum, bolstered by the viral spread of the confrontation at the press conference. The governor's office took notice, and within days an external agency was brought in to review the conduct of the Riverton Police Department. The town became a battleground of protests and counter-protests, with lines of supporters clashing in front of the station, their voices rising in competing chants. Ethan found himself at the center of it all, his days a blur of meetings, interviews, and community gatherings. He barely had time to catch his breath, but he kept pushing forward, knowing that each step brought them closer to justice. Chloe and Noah watched him with a new kind of awe, understanding more than ever that their father was fighting for them and for something bigger than any of them. As the days passed, Ethan realized that the fight had become about more than just the incident in the park. It was about changing the way Riverton saw itself, and about proving that even a small town could stand up to the weight of history and tradition. And as he watched the crowd outside the police station swell with each passing day, he began to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could win this fight after all. The pressure from Riverton's community, amplified by the demands of Ethan, Maria Harper, and other activists, led to the governor's decision to commission an independent review. This new team, drawn from an external state agency, began their investigation into the actions of Officers Dawson and Reed, as well as the broader policies of the Riverton Police Department. The town held its breath, waiting for the outcome that would determine the next steps for both sides of the debate. For weeks, the review team interviewed witnesses, analyzed police body camera footage, and spoke with community members about their experiences with the police. Ethan was called in to give a formal statement, and this time he brought Chloe and Noah with him. They sat together in a small conference room at a state office building, facing two investigators, a woman with a sympathetic expression and a man who took notes quickly and efficiently. Chloe sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Noah clung to his father's side, trying to look brave. Ethan reached over and gave their hands a reassuring squeeze. The lead investigator, Ms. Connolly, smiled gently at Chloe. "We know this has been hard for you and your brother," she said, her voice warm, "but we want to make sure your side of the story is heard. Can you tell us what happened that day in the park?" Chloe hesitated, glancing up at Ethan, who nodded encouragingly. She took a deep breath, then began to recount the events of that day, how the officers had approached them, how she felt when they searched her bag without explanation. Her voice trembled at first, but as she spoke, she seemed to find strength, her words growing clearer and steadier. "They made us feel like we were bad just for being there," she finished, her small hands gripping the edge of her chair. "But we didn't do anything wrong." Ms. Connolly nodded, her expression grave. "Thank you, Chloe. That's very brave of you to share." When it was Noah's turn, he spoke haltingly, his eyes welling with tears as he described how scared he had been. Ethan's heart ached to hear his children recount their fear, but he kept his expression steady, knowing that this testimony was a crucial step toward justice. After the interview, Ms. Connolly escorted them out, pausing at the door to shake Ethan's hand. "We'll make sure this review is fair," she promised, "no matter what pressure we face." Ethan nodded, clinging to that promise as they left the building. But he knew that promises alone wouldn't be enough. They would need real accountability, real change, for all of this to mean something. 2 weeks later, Riverton awoke to the news that the independent review's findings would be released at a public meeting held in the town's high school gymnasium. The space had been hastily repurposed for the event, with rows of chairs facing a podium and a projection screen where the findings would be displayed. The air was thick with anticipation as townspeople filled the gym, their voices blending into a nervous hum. Ethan sat near the front with Chloe and Noah, flanked by Maria and other community leaders who had been part of the protest from the start. He could feel the tension in the room, the eyes of those who wanted change, and the hard glares of those who felt their way of life were being challenged. The independent reviewers took the stage, Ms. Connolly among them. She adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat, her expression serious as she began to read from the report. The findings were stark and unflinching, painting a picture of a department with flawed practices and a pattern of treating certain residents with suspicion. The investigation revealed a failure to follow proper protocols in the stop and search of Chloe and Noah Green, Ms. Conley announced, her voice carrying across the crowded gym. The actions of officers Dawson and Reed were influenced by implicit bias, leading to an unjustified stop based on unsubstantiated reports. Furthermore, our review found systemic issues within the Riverton Police Department's approach to handling complaints and conducting community patrols. A murmur ran through the audience, gasps of shock, whispers of vindication. Ethan exchanged a glance with Maria, a spark of hope lighting in his chest. For the first time, it felt like the truth had broken through the barriers that had protected the status quo. Ms. Connolly continued, her voice gaining momentum. As a result, the review recommends disciplinary action for officers Dawson and Reed, a complete retraining of officers in implicit bias, and the establishment of a civilian oversight board to review future incidents. The crowd erupted into applause and shouts of approval, and Ethan felt a wave of relief crash over him, his shoulders sagging with the release of weeks of tension. He looked down at Chloe and Noah, who stared up at him with wide eyes, trying to understand what this moment meant. He leaned down, wrapping them in a tight hug. "This is it, kid," he whispered. "We did it. We made them listen." The day of the public apology arrived, a cool, overcast morning that seemed to mirror the somber mood of the event. The town square, usually bustling with weekend shoppers and families, had been transformed into a gathering place for what felt like the entire town. A stage had been set up in front of the Riverton courthouse, with a podium and microphones facing rows of folding chairs. Ethan, Chloe, and Noah stood in the front row, surrounded by Maria, Reverend Parker, and other allies. Ethan glanced over his shoulder, seeing the diverse faces in the crowd, those who had protested with them from the beginning, alongside those who had been more hesitant to acknowledge the need for change. He hoped this moment could begin to bridge that divide. Sergeant Mitchell took the stage first, flanked by Chief Hendricks, the town's police chief, who looked as if he hadn't slept in days. Mitchell's usual gruff demeanor had been replaced by a more subdued tone, and he spoke into the microphone with a solemn expression. "Good morning, Riverton," he began, his voice rough but steady. "We are here today to acknowledge the mistakes that were made by our department and the harm those mistakes have caused to the Green family and to this community. We failed to protect the dignity and safety of 2 children, Chloe and Noah, and for that, we are deeply sorry." He paused, glancing toward the crowd where Ethan stood with his children. The cameras trained on him captured every word, and Ethan saw the flash of doubt in Mitchell's eyes as he struggled to maintain his composure. "This department has a long history of serving Riverton, but we recognize that we need to do better, especially when it comes to building trust with all of our residents, regardless of their background. We are committed to implementing the recommendations of the independent review and to working with the new Civilian Oversight Board to ensure that incidents like this never happen again." Ethan felt Chloe's small hand slip into his, and he squeezed it tightly, a lump rising in his throat. He knew that this apology wouldn't erase the hurt, wouldn't undo the fear that his children had felt. But it was the beginning of a beginning, a crack in the wall that had kept their voices from being heard. Chief Hendricks stepped up to the podium next, offering a more detailed account of the changes they planned to implement. As he spoke, Maria caught Ethan's eye and nodded. It was time for their side to be heard too. Ethan took the stage, his heart pounding in his chest as he faced the crowd. He adjusted the microphone, taking a deep breath as he looked out over the sea of faces, some filled with hope, others with lingering doubt. He saw Chloe and Noah watching him from the front row, their eyes wide with a mixture of pride and anticipation. "I want to thank everyone who has stood with us," he began, his voice strong but laced with emotion. "This moment means a lot to my family, but it means even more to the future of this town. Today we heard an apology, and we're seeing steps toward real accountability. But we can't let this moment end here. Real change doesn't come from words, it comes from actions." He glanced at Maria, who gave him an encouraging nod, then continued. "When my children were stopped in that park, they were made to feel like they didn't belong, like their presence was somehow a threat. But Chloe and Noah belong here, just as much as anyone else, and no child should ever have to question whether they are safe in their own community." The crowd grew quiet, hanging on his every word. He let the silence stretch, then pressed on. "It's time for us to build a new kind of trust in Riverton. It's time for us to hold each other accountable, to listen to each other's stories, and to create a town where every person, every family, feels like they belong." A ripple of applause spread through the crowd, growing louder as people rose to their feet. Ethan took a step back, overwhelmed by the support he saw in so many faces, and a few tears slipped down his cheeks. Chloe and Noah rushed up to him, wrapping their arms around his waist, and he held them close, feeling the warmth of their embrace and the sense that maybe, just maybe, they had changed the world a little. The crisp air of early spring carried the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers across Riverton Park. The sky was vivid blue, dotted with a few fluffy clouds that drifted lazily over the town. It had been months since the public apology, since the protests had finally started to quiet, and Riverton had begun to change in ways that once seemed impossible. Ethan Green stood at the edge of the park, leaning against the familiar old oak tree, watching as Chloe and Noah pedaled their bikes up and down the winding paths. Their laughter, unburdened and free, filled the air, echoing through the park like a song. He smiled to himself, feeling a swell of pride and relief that he hadn't allowed himself to feel before. As he watched his children ride, he couldn't help but reflect on the journey they had taken together. The fear and confusion in Chloe's voice on that terrible day, the determination in Noah's eyes as he stood by his sister, and the unrelenting fight that had followed. It all felt like a lifetime ago. But he knew those experiences had changed them all in ways that could never be undone. Yet there was a new lightness to his children now, a sense of confidence that hadn't been there before. They had faced something no child should have to face, but they had come out the other side stronger. Ethan watched as Chloe slowed her bike and called out to Noah, her voice carrying on the breeze. "Come on, let's race to the swings." Noah grinned, and with a burst of energy, he surged ahead, his laughter blending with Chloe's as they raced across the grass. Ethan chuckled softly to himself, knowing that moments like these, simple and unremarkable to most, were the victories that mattered most. He wanted them to enjoy their childhood again, free from the shadows that had once loomed over them. A few weeks after the apology, Riverton's newly formed Civilian Oversight Board held its first public meeting at the town hall. Ethan had been asked to attend, along with Maria Harper, to help advise on the board's direction and to represent the community that had fought for its creation. The board's purpose was to review complaints of bias and misconduct and to ensure that the police department maintained transparency in its operations. The meeting was open to the public, and the room was packed with familiar faces, those who had marched alongside them, and even some who had opposed their efforts. But now there was a different energy in the room, a tentative willingness to listen, to engage in the difficult conversations that lay ahead. Ethan sat beside Maria at the front of the room, watching as the board members introduced themselves to a diverse group of residents, from local business owners to teachers to retired community leaders. They each spoke of their commitment to building a safer, more inclusive Riverton. Maria took her turn at the microphone, her voice strong and clear. "This board is about more than just reviewing complaints. It's about ensuring that everyone in Riverton feels like they have a voice, like they can be heard when something isn't right. We're not here to tear anyone down. We're here to build something better." Ethan followed her, stepping up to the podium and looking out over the crowd. He saw Sergeant Mitchell among them, standing at the back of the room with a watchful expression. Their eyes met briefly, and Ethan inclined his head in acknowledgement. The tension between them hadn't disappeared, but there was a new respect there. an understanding that they both wanted a better future for Riverton, even if they came at it from different directions. "I want to thank everyone who fought to make this board a reality," Ethan said, his voice resonating through the hall. "This is a new chapter for our town, but it's only the beginning. Real change takes time, and it takes all of us willing to confront the uncomfortable truths about our community. But I believe we can do it, together." The crowd broke into applause, and Ethan stepped down, feeling a sense of hope that had once seemed out of reach. Maria clapped him on the back as he returned to his seat, a knowing smile on her face. "We did good, Ethan," she said softly, "and we're just getting started." Back at home that evening, Ethan sat out on the porch, watching the sun set behind the row of houses that lined their quiet street. Chloe and Noah were inside, arguing playfully over a board game they had dug out from the back of a closet. He could hear their voices drifting through the open window. Chloe's exasperated explanations and Noah's stubborn refusals to follow the rules. It made him smile, even as he felt a bittersweet ache settling in his chest. He was still lost in thought when the screen door creaked open and Chloe stepped out onto the porch, her hair loose around her shoulders. She sat down beside him on the porch swing, tucking her knees up under her chin as she gazed out at the darkening sky. "Hey, Dad," she said quietly, her voice carrying that earnest tone she always used when she was working up to something serious. Ethan turned to her, raising an eyebrow. "What's on your mind, kiddo?" She hesitated, then looked up at him, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think people can really change? Like, do you think everything we did actually made a difference?" Ethan considered her question for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I think change is hard, Chloe. It doesn't happen all at once. But yeah, I think we made a difference. And I think a lot of people are seeing things differently now, even people who didn't want to listen before." Chloe seemed to mull that over, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "I'm glad we did it," she said finally. "Even if it was scary, I'm glad we didn't give up." Ethan wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her into a gentle hug. "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." They sat in silence for a while, watching as the last rays of sunlight faded into twilight. The air was filled with the sounds of a town beginning to wind down because of the night. Dogs barking in backyards, families calling their kids in for dinner, the faint hum of cars passing by on the main road. It was a peaceful sound, one that Ethan had never fully appreciated until now. After a while, Noah joined them, squirming his way into the middle of the porch swing. He leaned into Ethan's other side, letting out a contented sigh as he rested his head on his father's shoulder. The three of them rocked gently back and forth, the swing creaking beneath their weight. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like he could breathe again. The fight they had waged had taken so much from them, but it had also given them something in return, a new sense of strength, of belonging, of purpose. And as he looked down at Chloe and Noah, nestled against him, he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. A few weeks later, Ethan stood once more in Riverton Park, watching as the sun rose over the town, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. He wasn't alone. Dozens of people had gathered for a community cleanup event, organized by the Oversight Board as a way to bring the town together. Chloe and Noah were among them, chatting animatedly with a group of other kids their age as they picked up litter and planted new flower beds. Ethan watched them from a distance, marveling at how much had changed since that fateful day in the park. Riverton was still the same town in many ways, but it felt like it had grown, like its people had found the courage to face the things that had once been left unspoken. Sergeant Mitchell approached him, wearing a plain blue polo instead of his uniform. He carried a rake in one hand and a trash bag in the other. His face relaxed in a way Ethan had never seen before. "They've got some energy, don't they?" Mitchell remarked, nodding toward Chloe and Noah as they darted across the grass. "It's good to see kids being kids again." Ethan smiled, the tension that had once defined their interactions melting away. "Yeah, it is. It feels like a new beginning." Mitchell shifted, looking out over the park, his expression contemplative. "I want you to know, Ethan, that I meant what I said about changing things. We've got a long way to go, but I think we're moving in the right direction." Ethan nodded, appreciating the honesty in Mitchell's words. I believe that too, and I think we're both going to make sure it happens. They shook hands, a silent acknowledgement of the journey that had brought them here and the work that still lay ahead. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Ethan turned back to watch his children, a sense of peace settling over him like a warm blanket. The park was alive with the sound of laughter, the chatter of neighbors, and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it was the sound of a community that had come through the storm, ready to build something better. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan believed that Riverton's best days were still ahead. If you found this story inspiring and believe in the power of standing up for what's right, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us share more stories that matter and spread the message of hope, resilience, and change. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Thanks for being a part of our community, and let's keep pushing for a better future together.